I became an atheist when I was 17 years old, and I became a Christian while working on my PhD in theoretical physics. I'm here to testify that God is absolutely real, that He created our universe, that He loves us, and that the Bible is an authentic message from that very real and very loving God. I grew up in a small Mississippi swamp town, and Mississippi is the buckle right in the middle of the Bible Belt. My mother was an elder in our church, and I was in church every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, and every Wednesday night. I went to vacation Bible school in the summers. I went to youth retreats in the woods and youth retreats in the mountains and youth retreats on the beaches. I did a mission trip in the mountains of Jamaica. And when I was 16, I even gave the sermon on Youth Sunday. But by 17, I had left all that behind, and I had become a militant, anti-Christian atheist. What happened? Well, when I was 16, I left home to go to school at the Mississippi School for Mathematics and Science. It's a state-funded boarding school for high school juniors and seniors interested in pursuing a career in math and science. Not long after I left, the life of my youth pastor back home just completely collapsed. His wife left him, and as a divorcee, he was unable to continue working in ministry. He ended up selling insurance, all through no fault of his own. How could God let that happen? I figured either God didn't care or God didn't exist. I came to the conclusion that God was simply a delusion created by people to give them some comfort in an uncertain world, and that the church was simply filled with hypocrites. I mercilessly taunted all the Christians around me, and you know what they did? They were absolutely insidious. They prayed for me, and they told me that they were praying for me. For many years, I drifted back and forth between atheism and agnosticism. I realize now, though, that God was calling to me all during this time, and that He let me wander off so that I could witness to the reality of God in science, and the reality of God in history, and to the reality of God within my own life. God works in funny ways, and it was actually an atheist quantum mechanics professor who finally convinced me that there is a God. When I was in graduate school, I had an atheist quantum mechanics professor who would often end his lectures by saying, "Hail Odin!" He said it was okay for him to say that because he worshiped the ancient Norse gods. We all knew he was an atheist, though, and that he was just taunting the Christians in the room. I was an agnostic at the time, and one day, one of those Christians raised her hand at the beginning of class, and she asked the professor if he could talk about fine-tuning. I had never heard of that before, and I remember the professor coming around to the front of his desk, sitting down and saying, "Okay, we have to be honest. The laws of physics certainly look created because they are extremely specific. Changing pretty much any parameter, even by a very tiny amount, would result in a universe where life wouldn't be possible. But there's something called the anthropic principle that says that since we can only exist in a universe where the laws of physics make it possible for us to exist, none of this means anything." A couple of days later, I ran into that professor outside of class, and I said to him, "You know, I've been thinking about this anthropic principle, and it kind of seems like a cop-out because the real alternative is that we simply don't exist at all." And this is what he said: "We don't know yet why the universe exists, but I like to think that the idea of the universe is so compelling that it has to exist. But we don't really know yet why the universe exists." And he rushed off. That got me thinking that if the idea of the universe is so compelling, doesn't that imply that there's a mind in which the idea exists? So since the universe certainly looks created, I started looking for that creator. I studied many different religions, and then one day an old friend of mine, who was a Christian, challenged me to read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I promised him that I would, and I even bought the book, but that book sat on my shelf for a couple of years before I finally picked it up, kind of on a whim one day, and then I couldn't put it down. That book showed me that the Christian faith of my youth, the one that I had mocked so mercilessly before, was actually the power behind all of Western civilization. The reality of God speaks to us, not just from our own personal experiences, but God is there in the laws of physics. God is there throughout all of human history. And if we want to find God, all we have to do is seek him, because he's been right there waiting for us all along.